One of my favorite things in the world to do is watch Friends. I know it's been off for years and years. It's not even around, but I still find myself binge watching old episodes. And I was thinking about this today and thinking, it's the predictability of the friends in the circle, right? You have Chandler with his quirkiness, Monica with her type A of just everything has to be so neat and tidy and organized. It's Phoebe's ability to make you laugh at her silly songs. Ross always comes in with those smart comments, and Joey and him and his food, like it is just so hilarious. And of course, Rachel, she just brings everybody together, and it's just such this beautiful, cohesive team of people. And it's why I wanted to come on and share with you today that I have an opportunity for you to find your friends in the content creation space. So if you are thinking about creating your first or your next digital course, I don't want you to miss this opportunity because Amy Porterfield just opened the doors for registration for her Course Confident Bootcamp. And I'm actually offering a special bonus for anyone that registers for the Course Confident Bootcamp through my special link. So I want you to go to krystalprofit.com/Amy-bootcamp to register. That's krystalprofit.com/Amy-bootcamp. And what you're going to find when you get there is I have this special bonus private podcast series. It's called Money Mindset for Creators. So I want you to go register for Amy's bootcamp, download the podcast, and immediately start listening to it, because what this training is set up to do is to help you get your mind right about monetizing your content, making money so that you can fuel your content creation dreams. So go to krystalprofit.com/Amy-bootcamp to register for Course Confident. And I cannot wait for you to find your friends and find the people that will be there for you. Do you see what I did there? Yeah, nice little friends segue connection. Go to krystalprofit.com/Amy-bootcamp. And I cannot wait to see you inside. Okay, let's get into today's episode. Time to be spent, or wasted, I should say, searching the web, trying to find all the right ideas and all the amazing things that are out there, and you just end up overwhelmed. Trust me, I've been there, done that, took home the souvenir. But this podcast is going to help you in practical ways, because twice a week we'll be delivering episodes that are going to give you steps to help you create a podcast your audience can't wait to listen to. So let's get right to it, shall we? So like I said in the beginning, today's episode is another question from the community. And today's question specifically is, I have a company I want to approach about doing some advertising on my podcast, but I don't know how to determine what they should pay for airtime. Any insight? So this is the question I'm going to answer today. So as you think about approaching a company for a potential sponsorship, there are two really important things that I want you to consider. The first one is, I want you to establish the goals that are going to be set for both of you, because obviously you are seeking sponsorship because you would like to offer products or services to your audience that are going to add value, but also you're probably trying to make some money. Maybe your podcast is your side hustle, or you're trying to replace your full-time income with your amazing podcast content. Those are both commendable goals to have for yourself, but you have to set very specific goals in order for this to work. So the first question I want you to ask yourself is, why would someone give you money? That's bottom line. Why would someone give you money to advertise their stuff on your show? So the first thing that I want you to consider is, what are you offering? What are you offering? What do you have of value to offer a potential sponsor? So, and when I'm talking about all this, I want you to think about, if you have a smaller podcast, right? You don't have the millions of downloads and your show hasn't grown to this exponential, giant, mega media company. Maybe you just have a small show, but you have a very engaged audience and you want to approach a local company that is super niche within what you're doing, then I think that that's important to note because that is where a lot of people are starting these days. You have a small podcast, but you know that your audience is truly engaged and they're hanging on your every word. And if you ask them to do something, you put calls to action within your podcast and they actually go and do them. That is a super engaged audience. And there's something to be said about that because you could have millions of downloads, but if it's just something that people really aren't reacting to what you're saying, then maybe that's not something to highlight to your sponsors. So you want to make sure that you have something that you're offering to this potential sponsor. When we're talking about what you're offering, we're not talking about fairy tale dreams and unicorn wishes here, okay? Like I'm actually talking about hard data. So whether that's your number of listeners and your downloads, or it's the actual demographics, I want you to be very specific about your audience demographic, okay? Not just, oh, I speak to business people. Well, there are so many different kinds of business people. Are you speaking to entrepreneurs? Are you speaking to executives? Are you speaking to laborers or contract workers or freelancers or creatives? Like there's so many different aspects of being a quote unquote business person. You need to be very, very specific. Like the more you can get down to, like, I know the age of my audience, like the rough estimate of how old people are listening to this podcast, watching this video show. I know exactly what range that they're in. I know that most of them are female. Not all of them. I do have some guys out there. So shout out to you guys listening to this podcast and watching this video show. But I know that most of them are interested in using a podcast as part of their marketing strategy. I don't have a ton of true crime fans that are wanting to start these true crime podcasts or someone that wants to do an improv comedy show. Those really aren't my people. If you're here and that's what you do, that's amazing. I'm so excited that you're part of this community. But to be honest, that's not where most of my demographics fall. So I want you to make sure that you know exactly who is listening to your podcast and some of those things that can make you more marketable to potential sponsors. But if you're saying, Krystal, I have no idea what these specific demographics are, well, this is why I like to have a website for my podcast. It helps me install my Google Analytics. That way I can check in and be like, oh, these are the type of people that are listening to my podcast. Here are their interests. It'll also pinpoint location, like where people are, which a lot of these are provided by your podcast hosting site. But with Google Analytics and some other like data mining things out there, you can get even more specific. And I'm telling you, like the numbers and the hard data are key to developing something that you want to hand over to potential sponsors and say, hey, look, here's all the numbers. This fits within the people that you're trying to target. So I think that we can make a fantastic partnership. And another reason to have this hard data is because people like to see that. They like to see, number one, that you're showing up as a professional ready to do business. But number two, it helps them make a more informed decision because maybe they're a little hesitant to advertise on your podcast. They've never done this type of advertising before. But if you let them know, hey, this is like the range of people that I'm reaching every single week or, a certain number every single month, then that helps them know and compare that to their other advertising dollars being spent elsewhere. They can say, well, maybe we'll try this out and we'll only set this amount, but they're still willing to try, as opposed to just saying, oh, I have this podcast that kind of aligns with what your business does. Do you want to advertise with me? That doesn't sound like you're coming as prepared as you could if you had this hard data. Like that makes me more excited. I mean, maybe that's just because I'm a numbers nerd when it comes to statistics and watching charts and seeing everything. But when people can actually see that, then they're like, okay, this is going to be money well spent. Or maybe it gives you a starting point to say, okay, this is where I at least need to be in order to work with this company. And if that's the case, then you need to find out what those exact numbers are. Are they looking for a specific number of listeners, or do they prefer to know your overall downloads? These are the questions that you need to ask when you start to approach a potential sponsor. But while we're talking about statistics, I wanted to make sure and note that statistics aren't all the end all be all and the only way that you can work with a potential sponsor. So don't feel like you have to pull back the curtain on your entire show and give everything that's going on, okay? I understand what it's like to grow slowly. It took me nearly 5 months to get my first 1,000 downloads, okay? So if you are not to that point, then I get it. I've had students and clients that have had way more success. I have a client of mine who was able to reach 1,000 downloads in her first month. And so I know that this ranges from podcast to podcast, from industry to industry. So just know that you don't have to pull back the curtain and show them all of your numbers, okay? Don't feel pressured into doing that if you don't feel comfortable, because this is the second thing I wanted to share with you today. If you feel like your podcast is not to a point where you have thousands of downloads every single month, but like I said at the beginning, you have a super engaged audience, then I want you to consider approaching a potential sponsor with a trial offer. What does that mean? It means exactly how it sounds. It means approaching someone and saying, hey, these are my numbers, okay? Whatever numbers you feel comfortable. I honestly think that you should start with your demographics and really understanding exactly who's listening to your show, knowing who they are, what they like, what their interests are, maybe what their pain points are, what are their frustrations. So let me give you an example. I have a podcast and a video show about podcasting. And I know that's super meta, but it's what I do. It's what I talk about. It's what I live and I breathe. And so I'm constantly interacting with podcasters, whether they are brand new, they haven't started, they're in the creation stage, or they've been doing it for a while, but they're not seeing the results that they want. I understand where they're frustrated. I know that the technology scares brand new podcasters. I know people that have been doing it for 6 months to a year. They've kind of plateaued and they are wanting to know how to grow their audience, how to build their listener base. I know that these are struggles that they have because I'm constantly talking to them. So if that's the only takeaway you get from this, it's you need to understand exactly who your audience is, what they're coming to your podcast for, and how you can use that information to partner with a potential sponsor. But back to the trial offer. So what does that mean? So I suggest you approaching a company and saying, hey, here's the deal. How about for a trial basis, you can advertise on the podcast, let's say for 4 episodes and for X amount of dollars. Well, what does that mean exactly? So this is what I would suggest. You approach a company, you say, I will give you 4 30-second spots, 30 seconds to a minute, whatever you feel comfortable with and whatever you think will fit best into your show, and say, okay, let's just call it $200, okay? That's roughly $50 per ad spot. You say, for $200, you get 4 1-minute slots. I will advertise your company, I will talk about the benefits, and I will make sure that I put my own personal spin on it. That way, my audience knows that this is genuine, this is something I'm excited about, and then see what happens. So for the company, it's only $200, okay? They're probably spending a lot more marketing dollars in their other avenues. So I suggest that this is a great place to start. You could even start with $100, okay? $25 an episode is a steal if they are able to reach even 50 more people than they would have never reached otherwise just listening to your podcast. And of course, this amount and, this whole trial basis is going to vary from podcast to podcast, business to business. But I want you to have a starting point, $25 an episode. That's very reasonable for a company to spend. And it's something that I know most people will feel comfortable with if they have no idea where to start. Because I know a lot of you, I know you're afraid to ask for those dollars, but you know that you need to start approaching sponsors in order to sustain your podcast over its lifetime. So I want you to at least have this baseline starting point. And the last thing that I want to say about trying out a trial offer is you need to set up the metrics in order to know if the ads were successful. So this could either mean you setting up a link on the sponsor's website, or I guess you wouldn't set that up. They would set up a link on their website to see, are people actually going to this page that you talked about? So for me, this is actually a great place to start. I want you to go to krystalprofit.com/sponsor. Like if that was a sponsored, like this is what I would do is I would set up a specific URL just for this sponsor. You won't find anything else there. But what you're going to find at this specific link are the 6 things that I think that you need to include whenever you're pitching a potential sponsor. It's going to have the information that you need and then some of the things that I want you to consider while you're pitching a potential sponsor. But you definitely need to have some kind of metrics in place. So if you were to have your own URL or maybe a discount code, if that's what you were offering, let's say you wanted to approach a company and have their product sponsor your episode, then you would say, okay, I need to have the domain name and then a specific either URL or a specific discount code that's tied to your podcast. So it could be blah, blah, blah company.com/podcast, or it could be, the Profit Podcast, whatever. Like this is something that you and the company will decide on, but you need to have this metric in place. That way you can measure success, because what if you do this on a trial basis and then you're like, did it work? Did something happen? I don't even know, because we didn't set up the parameters to really measure the thing the way we were supposed to. And you, as the podcast host, you want to make sure that the advertising campaign is successful. So all the things that you can do to make sure, whether it's putting the links in the show notes, advertising that particular episode on social media, emailing your list, like all the things, you want to make sure that you're doing everything in your power to make this ad campaign as successful as possible. That way people want to come back and sponsor your podcast. They want to come back and just continue promoting their products and services with your podcast. So I hope I got your wheels turning about approaching a potential sponsor and, just the tips and the strategies that you can use to find a sponsor for your show. So make sure you go to krystalprofit.com/sponsor, or you can go to the show notes for this episode, krystalprofit.com/episode 120 to find all the stuff that we talked about here today. But y'all, I'm loving these questions from the community. So if you have a specific question about your podcast, about statistics, about content creation, like all the things, send me an email, krystal@krystalprofit.com. Make sure that we get connected. Send me something on social media, but I would love to hear from you. But that does it for this episode. So if this is your first time tuning in, make sure that you subscribe. That way you don't miss any of our future episodes. I have some really cool stuff planned for the next few weeks. We're talking about statistics and increasing your listenership. There's just all kinds of really cool things that we're talking about. So make sure that you subscribe. If you haven't had a chance, I would pretty please really appreciate you leaving a review for this podcast. It helps us push it out in front of more people and impact more entrepreneurs that want to confidently start, launch, and market their podcast. Make sure that you sign up for the free podcast bootcamp, krystalprofit.com/podcast bootcamp. And remember, keep it up. We all have to start somewhere. Hey, Profit Podcast listeners. Thanks for sticking around to a little bit after the episode to hear this special message, because I want to hear from you. We are starting a new segment called fan mail shout outs, and I want to hear from you, and I want to hear your questions. What do you want to know? What questions have you been dying to ask me? So here's how to make this happen. Go to the app where you're listening to this podcast right now. Go there. I'll wait a second. Okay. Now, once you're there, you're going to see a hyperlink at the top of the episode description that says, send Krystal a text message. And that's all I want you to do. Send me a text. It could be casual, informal. It could be totally anonymous. Or if you want, you can include your name and the name of your podcast or content wherever you are creating, and I will give you a special shout out in an upcoming episode. So again, go to the show notes for where you're listening to this episode right now, and it will say, send Krystal a text message. And I cannot wait to hear from you and give you a shout out in an upcoming segment of fan mail shout outs.